Hi there, this is Ryan with ZombieRacks, and today we're going to be installing a Wasteland style rack system on this Porsche Cayenne that's already been outfitted with some Yakima HD tracks. To begin, we're going to want to verify you've received all packages for your order, which will probably look something like the pile here. And we'll want to go ahead and unpack it all and lay everything out like so. Now, we always recommend first laying everything out to make sure all components are present before installation begins. Now, for this particular install, you're going to need a 13mm wrench, 10mm wrench, and a set of metric Allen keys. Moving right into rack components, up first will be our threaded slugs in the black finish, which are used to join latitude cross sections, followed by connector slugs in the gray finish, which are used on longitudinal connections. Connector slug hardware is laid out showcasing the longer bolt with 2 saddle washers and a flanged lock nut. Threaded slug hardware encompasses the shorter bolt along with a single saddle washer. Up next will be our hinge mount assemblies, complete with these track nuts designed to be used on a variety of extruded aluminum track systems. Hinge mounts are comprised of the lower 2-piece hinge assembly, the standard mounting plate, and these 8mm socket cap bolts with washers and a flanged lock nut. For the main rack assembly, we'll start with the crossbars, which will vary in length depending on the application, but will always have this single hole on each end. The particular rack showcased here is our dual radius system, so the front and rear ends of the rack will each feature a radius assembly. The center of the rack will be comprised of intermediate assemblies. These are not side-specific and can be laid out as such for installation. We'll begin by prepping our hinge mount assemblies. I'm going to speed up some portions of the video in an effort to cut overall time, but I'm just making the work area. Start by laying out each of the components. First, the standard mounting plate, then the 2-piece hinge assembly. With a quick show here that while these are not side-specific, we do try and orient the socket cap bolt heads so they're uniform in direction on both sides of the vehicle. Laying out the hardware, we'll have our 2 track nuts, followed by 2 of those M8 hardware sets. We'll go ahead and fast forward attaching our lower portion of the hinge mount to our standard mounting plate, making sure to keep everything hand tight. We'll then install our track nuts, only beginning to thread those small socket cap bolts in them so that they'll be easy to slide into the tracks that are already installed on the vehicle. Now that we have this one hinge mount assembled, I'll go ahead and use some movie magic to skip to these all assembled. We'll then just get these set aside for the moment, move on to assembling the rest of the rack. We'll now get our individual rack ends laid out and install our slugs and hardware. Threaded slugs can be laid out at the latitude contact points and the connector slug at the longitudinal point. Insert the connector slugs so that the hole lands centered with the rack connector holes. You'll then insert the bolt, flat washer, and saddle washer from the outside of the rack. Be sure that the saddle washer does seat correctly, followed by the second saddle washer, flat washer, and flanged lock nut on the opposite side. Tighten to the point where the connector still freely moves for adjustment later. For the threaded slugs, you want to insert the slug so that one of the 2 threaded holes is centered with a single hole in the rack. Then thread the bolt with a flat washer and a saddle washer so that the threaded slug can be slightly moved for adjustment later, similarly to that connector slug installed a moment ago.
Every day I'm sipping watching in slow-mo, changing the channel. 'Cause I don't wanna think about the past.
We'll ignore these mounting hardware sets for now and install the remaining threaded slugs and connector slugs. Note that these slugs cannot be interchanged, so make sure you install the right slug in its proper place. We'll speed this up for the sake of time. Movie magic. So now we have all of the threaded slugs and connector slugs installed with hardware. Note that we oriented the gray connector slugs so that the rack can be assembled from left to right on your screen. This just helps speed up installation. We're now going to finish connecting each rack end to one another on both sides of the rack using the connector hardware. We're going to fast forward on this to save some time. Now that each connector slug assembly is installed with hardware, we can move on to installing the crossbars onto the threaded slugs. You're going to want to install these all on one side of the rack first, doesn't matter which. Again, make sure these parts are loosely installed and not tightened. You'll then connect the remaining assembled side of the rack together with the crossbars you just installed. Take your time lining up each crossbar to its respective side. Don't force the rack assemblies together until you're sure each threaded slug is inside those crossbars. This is optional, but we find it's easier to rotate the rack assembly on its side to install the last bit of hardware. But be sure to put a moving blanket or towel down on the ground to limit scuffs on the rack. You'll then push down on the side of the rack so that the threaded slug holes not currently fitted with hardware can be installed. Make sure the threaded slugs are still loose and not tightened before this step. Once you're able to get all of the hardware installed, you can use your Allen key set to begin to tighten the rack in stages, typically working from the middle of the rack outward. Be sure to push down on the rack to close up any visible gaps between rack components as much as possible. Once you have everything tightened up, you can set the rack aside and we'll move on to installing the hinge mount assemblies onto the vehicle. Okay, so we've laid out the hinge mounts we have set aside for this install, and before we get to installing, make sure you have some towels or a moving blanket on your installation surface to protect against any marring or scratches. With the track nuts loose, you can simply slide the nuts into the track and roughly position the mounts. We'll go ahead and repeat this step for the remaining mounts. Make sure you have your mounting hardware set aside and accessible for our next step of installing the rack onto the mounts. Now, this 5-foot rack is fairly light, but we always recommend having a helping hand or two when lifting the rack onto vehicles. Once placed, move each of the mounts to their respective spots and begin to install the mounting hardware. Line up the standard mounting plate with the rack sections and mount 2 of the M8 hardware assemblies as close to the center of the rack as possible, and 1 hardware set as outboard on the rack as possible. Again, keep everything loose until all hardware is installed. Then just adjust the rack to the desired final position and tighten hardware to spec, which can be found in the assembly manual. And that's it for this Wasteland style rack system. Check out other installation videos for installing accessories and other rail styles. Cheers!